Hey, GeoTrekkers. When we think of extreme weather, we often think of tornadoes, hurricanes, other things that are really visually captivating. But one thing we often do not think about is air quality. Well, this summer, wildfires through Canada and a lot of urban and industrial pollution have made air quality a major story on the news. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Hal, host of the GeoTrek podcast. This week is all about air quality on the GeoTrek podcast as we go deep, learn more about what causes different types of air pollution, how you can monitor it, and what you can do to make yourself prepared for this and to take action to mitigate the effects of air quality on you and your family. Our guest, you're going to love him. He's David Liu, co-founder and CEO of the Clarity Movement, an environmental tech startup focused on changing how we understand the environment by deploying dense networks for real-time air quality monitoring. Prior to starting Clarity, David was a key leader in the University of California's fossil fuel divestment campaign and worked alongside the Arctic campaign director at Greenpeace. Fueled by his everlasting passion for improving our environment, namely mitigating climate change, David believes in using data-driven approaches to address the issues arising in global environmental crisis. David earned his BS in atmospheric science from the University of California, Berkeley, and I think you're really going to love all the insights he has to share on this topic. He's an expert in the field. He and the Clarity Movement worldwide are really changing the landscape for how we monitor, detect, and take action to protect ourselves against poor air quality and air pollution. It's going to be a great episode here on the GeoTrek podcast. If you're new to GeoTrek, we explore the world for stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. We're really looking to do three things. Number one, understand the physical processes behind extreme weather and natural disasters, understand their impacts on society, and then lastly, understand what we can do to mitigate the losses of these extreme events to make ourselves, our communities, and our families more resilient to anything that Mother Nature can throw at us. Hey, a quick housekeeping note here. In the conversation, at some point, David Liu and I talk about ozone pollution. Just a housekeeping note, don't confuse that with the ozone layer. So the ozone layer is in the stratosphere. It's higher up in the atmosphere, and it's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. The ozone layer in the stratosphere helps to block out harmful UV light and protects people from skin cancer and other kinds of problems that can come from getting too much sunlight. Ozone pollution, however, that's in the lower levels of the atmosphere, the troposphere, where we live and where we work and where we breathe. Ozone pollution often happens in urban settings where we have a lot of cars and industrial exhaust. When that interacts with sunlight and we have light winds, especially in the summertime, we get what's called ozone pollution. This is harmful and not healthy for people, and it's a big concern, but that's in contrast with the ozone layer in the stratosphere. They're two very different things, and we'll talk about that on the podcast. Well, hey, without any further introduction, let's get into this podcast with David Liu, where it's all about air quality. David, thank you so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast.
Thanks for having me.
David, a lot of people now are talking about air quality this summer. It's been in the news a lot with the forest fires in Canada producing a lot of smoke. There's also been a lot of urban pollution from ozone. This is something that's come up a lot in the news. Could you tell us a little bit about, the importance of air quality as far as something that people should be aware about?
Yeah, I mean, air pollution is probably one of the most pressing environmental crises that we are facing nowadays. It's causing roughly around 7 million premature deaths every year worldwide. And that's a staggering figure, right? In comparison to COVID, it has produced 7 million deaths throughout the whole duration of the pandemic versus air pollution, 7 million every year. Just let it sink in, right? So this is a really pressing issue, and it's getting worse because of the climate change. Evidently, the smoke we are seeing in the Midwest and the East Coast is evidence of that.
Yeah, David, this smoke in places like Chicago and Detroit, New York, Washington, coming all the way from Canada, that surprised a lot of people who did not think that wildfire smoke can travel that far. How far can smoke travel if it's coming from wildfires?
Yeah, so in this kind of wildfire events, you have the heat that's pumping the smoke to really high in the altitude, in the atmosphere. So that's enable the smoke travel very far, especially for the particles that's what we call PM2.5 or particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns. So these are the particles that's really harmful for us because it actually can penetrate to your lung and into your bloodstream. And it's small enough that it doesn't settle to the ground quick enough. So what we usually see, like sometimes the PM2.5 can travel around the globe. Like, there could be a sandstorm in Sahara and then somehow went all the way around the globe and impacting Europe. And that's just how crazy sometimes it is. Yeah.
David, let's talk a little bit about the physics of these particulate matters. So once we have particles in the atmosphere, that's called an aerosol. What are the different kinds of aerosol that can be out there?
Yeah, I mean, so PM2.5 is just a classification of aerosols of the size, right? So it doesn't technically talk about what's the composition of the particles. And for the composition of the particle, it can, it can be a lot. It can come from droplets, from the sea breeze to during the wildfire burning, you will see a lot of the black carbon, and that's result from the biomass burning. You will see in urban air pollutions, you have a lot of secondary secondary generated air pollutions that are from photochemical reactions. So for that, you have also black carbon, but also a lot of sulfur compounds. And so on. So in terms of the composition of such, it can be hundreds to thousands. If we really want to go into the speciation, in addition to this, there's dust, there's heavy metals, there's like literally just sand, and so it really varies. Yeah.
David, it sounds like you're saying some of these aerosols are natural, like maybe fires, volcanoes. Dust from the Sahara Desert, sea salt aerosol, but then some of them are also man-made pollutants as well.
Absolutely. I mean, so we have a Clean Air Act in the U.S. passing roughly 1960s, and that's primarily targeting all these man-made air pollutions in the urban area. So EPA back in the days actually took some photograph of what the city looks like, and it looks like just like the couple of days ago in New York City or what we're seeing in Chicago. But the difference is back then it was not caused by wildfire, it caused by all the man-made pollutions, right? So that's a lot of from the sulfur that we burned from the coal. Back then we don't really have a very strict emissions standards for the power plant, for industry, and for the cars. So every nasty things you can imagine is there, and it's creating a lot of the haze that we're seeing back then. But then since the Clean Air Act, we see a dramatic improvement of the man-made pollutions in the United States. I mean, it's nowhere close to be solved, but compared to what we see before, huge difference. However, most recently, I was started from West Coast, now impacting East Coast. There's a reverse of air quality improvements, mainly because of the wildfire.
Yeah, so some of these scenes that we're seeing out of urban areas with the haze and the smoke, the poor visibility, the pollution, you're saying before the Clean Air Act, we saw similar images, but instead of from wildfires, it was often from urban pollution or from industrial pollution.
Absolutely. I mean, even nowadays, if you go to country, unfortunately, like India, you will see similar episodes, and they don't have wildfire. That was not caused by the wildfire. It's still caused by the urban pollution. Yeah.
Yeah, David, a little bit more about you and your background. How did you become interested in this area of research?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in China. So I first-handed experienced a lot of bad air pollution episode back then. And I came to US. I studied atmospheric science from UC Berkeley. Yeah. And I think during the study, for me, I really just trying to find impactful way to really using my knowledge and to do something positive to the society. I think that's probably one of the driving forces behind the creation of Clarity Movement.
Yeah, and like you said, this is such a big public health crisis and problem that people may not be thinking about. I'm excited to hear more about Clarity on this podcast and learn, you're helping educate us about the problems of air pollution. And we'll be talking on this podcast as well about some of these solutions that are out there. So when people start seeing, now we're hearing on the news a lot about hazardous air, poor air quality, a lot this summer from the forest fires in Canada, but also we saw a lot of urban ozone pollution in places like Dallas and Houston and some of these places that had light wind speeds, a lot of traffic. When people see that there's compromised or lower air quality, what are some things that they should think about? I mean, how should they maybe change the way that they're living?
Yeah. So I think, we can go from one by one, right? So first on wildfire, unfortunately, there's few individual can do to change that. I think the best things we can do is really protecting yourself and protecting your families. When you're being out, wear a mask. I know it's controversial because of the COVID, but it's just protecting your house, period, right? That kind of particles, they're not good for you. They can penetrate into your bloodstream, causing a lot of the health problem down the road. In the past decades, a lot of the research has been really focusing on what's the health impact of the urban air pollution on our health. There's actually still a lot of understanding of what's the health impact of this wildfire smoke. I'm just saying they're not good. So really protecting yourself when you're outside, and then when you're inside, if you have an air purifier, turn it on. If you don't have, just turn your HVAC on fan, even if it's not cold or hot. It will filter some out. Yeah, so that's what would be my first advice in terms of how individual can act. In terms of urban air pollution, especially around the ozone, the cause of that can be much more complicated because ozone is not primary air pollutants. What I meant is not because it's not important. Primary air pollutant just means it's directly emitted from a pollution source. Ozone is a secondary air pollutant that is a result of photochemical reactions. The photochemical reaction is basically when you have nitrous dioxide plus total VOC, and then under the UV light, and that will result in ozone in the low atmosphere level where we breathe. And the ozone in this level is really bad. It's not it's not contributing to the ozone layer or anything. No, that ground level ozone is really bad for you. And I think why we're seeing so much high ozone level in Texas right now, just really primary two reasons. First, it's a hub of petrochemical industry. So there are a lot of total VOC being emitted from the drilling to refineries to all the process related to that. And the second is the heat, right? Like we are seeing records of high heat in the region. And for people who just learn a little bit about chemistry, that promotes chemical reactions. And that's why we're seeing such a high ozone level in the regions right now.
So David, when you said it's a photochemical reaction, so even having hundreds of thousands of cars emitting emissions, when you have summertime with high sun angles, the solar radiation is very intense. If you have that kind of situation with light winds, you don't get a lot of mixing. That's where you're setting up the stage for more ozone pollution. Absolutely. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I think like another like the car doesn't emit too much total VOC. So total VOC is very important to form the ozone. And then total VOC can be, a big source is from uh, petrochemical, and another big source is actually from agriculture. That's just a natural release of a lot of vegetations, and also cows. So that's why like in Seven King Valley they have a big ozone problem and particular problems in California, but because of the agriculture. But in I would say Houston, that's mainly because petrochemicals.
Yeah, interesting. It sounds like industrial areas and agricultural areas, especially, I would think there's more chance of ozone pollution in the summertime. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Probably because of the high sun angles. David, when you mentioned wearing a mask, what should people think about? Is there a certain kind of mask, a certain standard to the mask as far as what it's going to filter?
Yeah, it's actually pretty similar to the recommendation of COVID back then, because what you want to filter is particular like PM2.5 essentially. So the N95 is probably the gold standards, but now you have KN94 and all this. They're good. Surgical masks didn't do a thing in terms of filtering out the particular matters. That's PM2.5 in the air. It just doesn't do.
So you really need a mask that's going to do some filtering to filter out those particles. David, when air quality becomes lower, we often hear advice for people to stay inside. In general, is there filtering and air conditioning and HVAC? I mean, how does that work as far as protecting people if they stay indoors?
When you say air quality become lower, you mean air pollution get worse?
Yeah, when there's air pollution outside, or when we have compromised air outside.
Yeah. So in residential buildings, we usually don't do intake from the outdoors, right? So essentially, we circulating the air inside as a standard HVAC system. So for that, auto filtering is really happen in that, the little filters that they advise you to replace time by time. And the thing is, usually when we selecting that filter, we usually opt for efficiency. And so it means that, we choose a filter that doesn't create too much of pressure drop. But by then, that means it's actually not filtering too much of fine particles. So one advice could be trying to replace a filter that has higher grading in terms of what kind of particles it filter out. You don't have to go to the HEPA filter. That is essentially the filter used in the air purifier and the hospital. You can just use a higher grade one. It will do something. It's not going to be best, but it's not going. It's going to help with something. And again, air purifier. If you can get one, great. Just making sure that you really close the window, close the doors. If you don't do that, it's useless.
Yeah. And David, what's really interesting as we're following the weather reports and watching the news, it's amazing how the wind direction, the wind intensity can really change where the higher air pollution concentration is. And
Absolutely.
This brings up the importance of monitoring. And I wanted to get into, I know you and your team there at Clarity do a ton of work developing very high-end innovative products that help monitor air pollution. Could you tell us a little bit about Clarity and why it's so important to have quality monitoring for air quality?
Yeah, so Clarity was founded to empower both public and private sectors to fight against air pollutions by offering this very scalable yet accurate air quality monitoring infrastructure. So the way we do it is, we combine the state-of-the-art sensors, IoTs, and all the latest developments on data analysis, cloud, and we build into this turnkey solutions that's offering to this organization, and it will provide them a professional grade service of air monitoring. Yeah.
David, I wanted to ask you, so with Clarity, you have different products that are different sizes, different as far as different parameters and different designs, right? What are the different type of products that you have?
Yeah, so the most basic, hardware. So our service is we call sensing as a service. We actually have a hardware component, software component, and our expert support. So on the hardware side, we offer multiple options. The base option is this Clarity Nodes, essentially. So it's a solar powered built-in connectivity device that work out of box in 10 minutes in over 120 countries. So it's really built with in mind to be very scalable, very easy to deploy. So this is a big difference of what the air quality monitoring used to be. Traditionally, the air quality monitoring is usually done by um, governments. That's it's a size of a shipping container, and it costs $250,000 to buy and purchase, and $100,000 a year to just simply maintaining it. And when talking about placement and deployment, you're probably talking about months, in the degree of months, because you have to do the siting, powering, and everything. This we essentially trying to pack all the important things into this. So this is not to replacing this reference grade instruments, but we are aiming to supplement of what we can monitor. So this base node monitoring key air pollutants such as PM2.5 and nitrous dioxide, NO2. And in addition, this node is also a platform in which we can, using the accessory port on the side, to connect additional add-on modules to monitor pollutants such as ozone, as mentioned, and black carbon, which is a huge issues around health and the climate. And then we can also attach a wind module, an anemometer, to measure wind speed and the direction so that we can tell where the air pollution is coming from.
That's really interesting. So you can add on to that device to collect meteorological and weather data to kind of help you understand the local environment there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's everything. It's powered and streamed through our nodes back to our clouds, in which you can conduct a lot of interesting analysis. Yeah.
David, it sounds like you're saying traditionally the only option for monitoring air quality was a very large, expensive unit that you'd get through the government. And I would imagine if you have something that takes many months to deploy, if it's very large and expensive, you probably cannot have that many of them out there. From what
Absolutely.
I know about air pollution, it can change greatly over small space, right? So you probably want a more dense network, like what you can do through Clarity now.
Yes, that's absolutely our value proposition. It's essentially at a cost of one traditional air monitoring, you can deploy hundreds of our nodes across the city to keep providing a much granular pictures of where air pollution coming from. Traditionally, these reference monitors, they are roughly tens or hundreds miles apart in a city and states, so it doesn't provide that granular picture as you needed. And we know that in situation like wildfire, as you mentioned, is really dictated by wind patterns, speed, directions, and it can change quite a lot actually. And that's therefore we see the benefits of this. Yeah.
David, what are some examples where you've seen air quality change very greatly over small spaces, and how can monitoring that help people make better decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have a deployment with U.S. second largest school district, the LA Unified School District, in which we deployed 200 of our sensors across all their elementary school in the district. In the past, they had to rely on 2 to 3 reference monitor to basically, making decisions around air pollutions and how we can protect students' health. Now, instead of relying on that 203, they can rely on this 200 of sensors to make the decision. And some of variation we see is staggering. We're not talking about air pollution coming from wildfire, but just urban air pollution in LA. Unfortunately, nowadays you still see some really bad air pollution days in LA because of the geographic kind of features of the cities and the remaining pollutants in the cities. We sometimes see like basically the cleanest spot in the district compared to the most polluted spot in the district. We see a 10 time the difference of the pollution
Wow.
level. That's the difference between good air quality and unhealthy air quality.
So you're saying within the Los Angeles school district there, sometimes you could see a 10 times in difference as far as the amount of pollution from one site to another within the same school district.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. And that just shows how important it is to have localized information on what's happening at your school. I could picture schools using these types of decisions to determine if children are going to play outside at recess or things like that, right?
Yes, that's precisely what they're using this for.
Yeah, and we've seen, especially with say flood forecasting, with other types of weather, if your data is coming from 8 or 9 miles away, it might be very different than what's happening at your spot. It sounds like with Clarity, you're able to get a much denser network of these monitors to know what's really happening in your neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think not only just dense, but also where you're placing it is very, very important. Given that we really design in mind is that you can place it almost wherever you want. So by placing it next to the road versus, let's say, on top of a building has a huge difference of air pollution as well. So that we can enable to measure where people is actually breathing and where people is exposed to air pollution compared to where it's convenient to put the air pollution monitor.
Yeah, David, let's talk a little bit about this because a lot of our listeners are very enthusiastic about weather and climate. Sure. They're from professionals to hobbyists. So we know in general, when we deploy a weather station, we often want it, say, on the north side of a building. So we're avoiding direct sunlight, things like that. And the placement of a traditional weather station is very important. You want to put it in a place where it's exposed to the wind, things like that. What about for putting out a Clarity air quality monitoring? It sounds like you're saying put it in a place that's representative of where people will be breathing the air. Also, should it be in the sun because it has a solar component? Are there things you should think about as far as putting it in a place that gets more airflow or less airflow? I mean, what should we think about that?
Yeah, it entirely depends on the user cases of what people are trying to measure and why they're trying to measure, right? So if you are a city trying to understanding the impact of traffic to residents and pedestrians, then you probably want to put it next to the roads, not too far away from where the pollution source is, compared to, let's say, if you are a city just trying to understand the general air pollution levels, you probably want to put it in what we call a background site, like that can be atop of the buildings or in the middle of a park, in which you can see basically more like background information of the air pollution that is away, like kind of strip away from this very spontaneous emissions from the pollution sources. So it really depends on why you're doing it, what you're trying to measure. Yeah.
It sounds like it's really case by case of trying to say, why do we want these data and what kind of decisions do we make from that?
So that's why when we developing our solution, we really keep that flexibility in mind, right? We don't want people to be restricted by where I can access power and where I can access Wi-Fi, let's say. Yeah.
David, let's say I worked for a large city and we wanted to monitor air pollution through the city. So could we have all of the monitors hooked into the same network? Can they map out what the air quality is over space? I mean, what can we do with these data once we get them?
Yeah, I mean, there is incredible things you can do once you have this dense amount of the data. What I usually tell people is, this is an infrastructure that can be used for multiple different reasons. So one of our biggest network that's out there is actually a network we deploy with the City of London, in which now I think between 400 to 500 of our Clarity nodes was deployed throughout the cities. And the way the city is using it, the community is using it, we see so much diverse user cases, from uh, just simply informing the public about what's your local air pollution is, right? Something right next around your corner, you can tell, like, whether this is good for you, safe for you to go outside, exercise. So this public awareness piece is important. But then, sorry, I think uh, it froze a bit. But then the policymaker can use this data to really truly understand their policy impact. So one of the signature policy that London has formed is this called clean air, outer low emission zone. So essentially, it's a policy that restricts certain type of vehicle entering into the center of the city. So then we can really using this kind of air quality data to understand really what's the impact, right? Do we see a dramatic reduction of air pollutions, or do we just simply see a redistribution of pollutions because traffic has to go somewhere? This just means that we are impacting some outer London places versus the inner London places.
That's interesting. So there's like an interface or an interaction between policy and what's actually happening in atmospheric science. You're saying Clarity nodes can help to see, okay, how does a change in policy really affect the air that people breathe?
Absolutely. That's essentially our mission. I mean, we usually draw a metaphor, right? I think given the limited data we had before, a lot of times when we trying to think about the policy to improve air quality, it's often like playing a chess without seeing the chessboard. So what we are doing is providing that clarity what's actually the air quality is in the regions in real time. So, and in the resolution that you need, so that we can provide that chessboard for you to really understand what's the impact of your policy and how you can optimize it.
Yeah, really, you're helping people make informed decisions, and you're also helping society understand if we change maybe the amount of cars in an area, if we change some of our activities, how does that affect the atmosphere around us?
Absolutely. It not only just, you may think, oh, maybe this is only for the city. No, there's actually a lot a smaller organization can do. A lot of our user cases, for example, is done for the schools, in which they want to measure the impact of, let's say, if we change, like if we introduce no idling policies for the school, how much reduction of air pollution we're seeing there, right? Does it actually make a difference? Oh, it does. Or if we change, like a road, we're introducing bike lanes for a certain small districts, so boroughs of the cities. How does that really change, and how does that really benefit in terms of our house? And I think that's one important pieces that often lack in a lot of the city planning is we can't really quantify. So we can quantify the economical benefits and so on, but one important piece is we usually miss is the health benefits that coming from the reduction of air pollution. And then you can't really quantify that health benefits unless you can quantify the reduction of air pollution, and that's where we can help.
Yeah, this is really amazing because now all of a sudden we can do what we call trial and error, right? You can say, let's make a no idling policy here, and if we had air pollution data in the old policy and air pollution data in the new policy, we can actually see what we are doing and how that maybe makes a change.
Yeah, and you don't have to spend $250,000 to do it.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. David, you mentioned London has thousands of these nodes across the city. What are some other international cases? I mean, you're in many different countries, right? What are some of the other international interests out there?
Yeah, I mean, we see a tremendous diversity of use of such technology. So in more developed countries, such as in US and in Europe, it's really about how to optimizing a lot of policies, how to addressing situation like environmental justice, inequality. That's what we are facing in the US quite a lot. But then when you go into developing country, in which the air pollution just still huge issues, and their infrastructure is lacking, that to really provide them a lot of opportunity to leapfrog, right? So instead of, let's say, spending like $2.5 million to deploy 10 monitoring stations in a city, to think about what you can do with half of the budget. So maybe you do 2 to 3 reference grade monitoring station and deploy hundreds of our sensors in the cities, right? This, what we call like air monitoring 2.0, is what we envision for an ideal scenario in which the city can really get a both and benefit from the both. And then we are seeing that in a lot of the developing countries we're working at. So in Southeast Asia, such as Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and in Africa, such as Ghana, Nigeria, in which, like the infrastructure was not there. But with this, it will provide them a tremendous opportunity to really leapfrog a lot of the older concept. Yeah.
Well, and that's a good point. I had lived several years in Africa, and I saw in some nations where they haven't had things like the Clean Air Act, you get even just the amount of emissions behind your average truck or different vehicles on the road or factories. You could tell just by spending a day on the ground. Sometimes there's very heavy air pollution. It sounds like you're saying Clarity can help monitor and just help people really know what's going on with their air quality and help public health in those areas.
Absolutely. We can help, and we are helping. We are deployed in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Uganda. That's, we are there.
David, do you have a count on how many different countries are using the Clarity product?
Yes, we actually have deployed in more than, I would say, 70 countries. The exact number is changing.
Yeah. Well, that it just shows that it's a quality product that's doing good science. But like you said, it's small, it's mobile, and it's also affordable. That people can get more of these monitors out there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's essentially our goal. Yeah.
David, do you have any last take-home messages for our listeners? Any last things that you'd like to share, that maybe the most important thing that people should be thinking about in relation to air quality?
Yeah, I think, I would like people to treating this kind of thinking about the air pollution episode we're seeing in the Midwest and the East Coast really as a canary bell in the coal mine, in which this is the alarm of the climate change, right? I think a lot of us may think climate change, even still now in the US, is a very diverse topics. We have a very polarized view and a very political size. But come on, no matter what's your political standing, we are breathing the same air, and from what we're seeing, they're not getting better, right? And this is undeniable, and I really want to urge everyone to, really seeing this, really meeting this reality and accept this reality. We really need to act in order to, to confront this crisis. Yeah.
David, something I found really interesting this summer with the Canadian fires is that a lot of the places that people expect to see air pollution, maybe large cities like Los Angeles, Houston, New York, those are the places where people may expect to have reduced air quality. With the Canadian fires, a lot of this smoke and everything, it's coming into places like the Midwest, the Great Lakes, places like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. People always expect very clean air quality there. And in the latest maps, it shows it's been very unhealthy. So it almost shows it doesn't matter where you are, air quality can become an issue, especially with things like raging wildfires.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, with the reality we're having, wildfire will be coming a pretty frequent, natural disaster that we're facing. Obviously, there's a lot we can do in terms of forest management and so on to improving that. But, you will getting this hotter and hotter season, and it's not going to get better. Yeah.
David, how can people find you online, or how can they learn more about Clarity?
Yeah, but you can simply go to clarity.io That's our website. Yeah, I'm not big on social medias, but you can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Yeah.
Well, David, the work you and your team are doing, it's very important. Like you said, this is a public health crisis that's affecting millions of people a year. Air is just something that many of us take for granted, but we've seen, especially in recent times, air quality can become a huge public health problem. And just want to congratulate you and your team for doing a great job with getting these air monitors out there. And we're looking forward to following Clarity online and seeing the latest products that you're innovating.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for taking time to come on the podcast.
Bye.
David, thank you so much for taking time to come on the GeoTrek podcast. You shared a lot of really amazing insights with us that have a big impact. A few of the big take-home messages I got from this podcast, I couldn't believe it when David said that there are 7 million premature deaths annually around the world because of air pollution and poor air quality. 7 million deaths per year. If there's a hurricane impact with more than 100 deaths, it becomes an enormous story. It's very high profile. He's talking about 7 million deaths per year. That's just really shocking, I think, because a lot of the really high profile images and videos and things that we see on social media and on the mainstream media relate with tornadoes, hurricanes, a lot of the things that are very photogenic. If there's a photogenic tornado tearing up someone's farm in Kansas, that's going to be going crazy and viral on the internet, but it might directly only impact a few dozen people. What David's talking about here is the premature death of 7 million people per year. And a lot of that isn't really photogenic. I mean, we've seen some images now of the haze and the orange skies in places like Washington and New York over the last several weeks to months, but a lot of times air pollution kind of goes invisible. If a community lives in the shadow of an industrial facility, for example, a lot of that air pollution may be detected by a Clarity monitor, a Clarity node, but it's not going to be really photographed. It's not really going to be spreading around social media, and a lot of people may not even have awareness of it. So I think what David really did here was to help educate us about the massive public health crisis that air quality can inflict on people around the world. And I'm really thankful for that. I think that was very ety-opening here on the podcast. Again, David shared the website that you can go to clarity.io. That's Clarity, CLARITY.io. If you want to see more about the Clarity movement, what they're doing, and these amazing detection systems that they can get out there with, again, these relatively small and inexpensive units that accurately measure dangerous particles and help you monitor what's going on. I thought it was really interesting, the examples he shared from London, where they have hundreds to maybe thousands of these nodes around the city, and also the second largest school district in the United States, Los Angeles School District, has many of these monitors as well, so that they can monitor what's going on for their children's safety. Like, for example, if they should let the kids out for recess or not. That got me thinking, especially for cities, for counties, for a lot of different municipalities around the country, as well as school districts, companies, different organizations, different environmental groups. It may be affordable for you to invest in Clarity monitoring to get out there and monitor what's happening in your neighborhoods and communities. It reminded me too, talking to David, about how localized air pollution is. It can be very localized depending on if it's point source pollution, say from an industrial site, and even what we're seeing with wildfire pollution, it can travel a long distance, but if the fire is not upwind from you, you may not be that far from the fire and you may have fine air quality. It seems like it can change a lot over short spaces, and that's why detection and monitoring is so important. I've been checking out online some different websites that show monitoring of air quality around the US. One that our listeners may find interesting is just called fire.airnow.gov. That's FIRE.airnow, AIRNOW.gov. That's a real-time map around the country showing air quality all the way from good quality to moderate to unhealthy and hazardous, and it's updated in near real time. It's been really interesting to see where these plumes of pollution are going, and that not only depends on the source of the pollution, but also the wind direction and the wind speed seems to really dictate a lot of these spatial patterns. So really interesting stuff. Obviously, the air quality has been in the news. What we've seen in recent years, when we get really strong wildfires out there, they often don't just disappear in a short amount of time. If once we get into a pattern where it's very dry and there's prevailing winds going a certain direction, they can last for a long time. And so I have a feeling that we may see a lot of issues and a lot of high profile stories with air quality for the rest of the summer. But it's good to know that David and his team are out there helping us to better detect air quality and pollution from not only wildfires, but also urban and industrial sources as well. Hey, I wanted to thank our listeners for making us the #1 podcast for natural disasters, according to FeedSpot. Really, it's your listenership and people telling people. So many people have said, oh, we shared this podcast with our friends or our family or our coworkers. Again, we're trying to do very relevant stories that are not in the mainstream media, going really beneath the story and behind the story to understand the people that it impacts, what the solutions are for mitigation, and really how it can relate to you. So if you know of anyone impacted by the smoke, by wildfire, air pollution, or urban air pollution, please share this podcast with them. I think it could really help them understand the hazard better and help to keep them safer. Wanted to give a shout out as well to our marketing team with CNC Catastrophe and National Claims and the GeoTrek podcast. They do a great job editing and disseminating this content every time we do a new episode. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Dr. Hal. Stay safe, get out there and enjoy nature, but obviously keep your situational awareness and stay safe this summer. Watch out if you're in an area with air pollution. Like we heard on this podcast, even a point source of a wildfire, we can have pollution for hundreds or even more miles than that. So it can affect a lot of areas. Everyone, get outside, stay safe, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast. This is Dr. Hal signing off.